Have you ever wondered who Cain's wife was? The man marked by the first murder in history? How did someone condemned to exile manage to start a family? In this video, we'll dive deep into the mystery surrounding this enigmatic figure and discover what this riddle can teach us about our own choices, relationships, and redemption. Stick with me, because not only will we answer these intriguing questions, but you'll also understand how this knowledge can impact your spiritual life. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button right now, and at the end we'll say a powerful prayer to help us connect more deeply with God. At the beginning of humanity's journey, after Adam and Eve's expulsion from Eden, the first child of this new phase was born, Cain. The couple's firstborn carried the weight of a story filled with both redemption and mystery. Still living under the shadow of the fall, Eve looked at her firstborn son with hope. Adam's smile reflected an expectation of redemption, as if the life of this new being could somehow correct the wrongs of his parents. The environment was harsh, but the birth of Cain brought light to an existence marked by loss. Despite the hardships they faced, the couple still felt the divine presence, though distant. The winds of Eden, which once brought refreshment and safety, now served as reminders of their punishment. Yet Cain was a promise, a symbol of life in the midst of exile. Each glance Eve gave to her newborn was a blend of pain and hope, a silent belief that redemption was near and that Cain could be the key to restoring the lost protection. As Cain grew, the land around him seemed to reflect his development. Weeds sprouted in Adam's crops, and the struggles to cultivate the earth were constant reminders of the fall. Nonetheless, Cain stood out amidst the hostile environment, helping his father with the fields and enduring the hardships of hard work. There was a strength in him that was evident, as if the burden of carrying the legacy of the first family weighed on him, but also strengthened him. The mystery around Cain deepened as he became aware of his reality. Growing up, he heard stories of a time when his parents walked with God in perfect communion. This contrast between what was and what now was his reality stirred something in Cain, a restlessness, a desire to understand why things were the way they were. God's silence after the expulsion created a void he didn't know how to fill. Adam and Eve remained silent about many of the details of Eden, perhaps out of guilt or perhaps to protect him. They tried to teach Cain to cope with this new life, with hard work and the limitations imposed on them. Cain's upbringing reflected the need to adapt to exile, and he grew up understanding that his journey, like that of his parents, would be marked by struggles. But what they couldn't foresee was the emotional and spiritual weight this new reality would impose on their firstborn. As Cain grew older, he gazed up at the sky and felt that something was missing. His connection with the earth was deep. He understood it in ways few could. Yet this same bond seemed to be the cause of his anguish. The soil he worked didn't bring him the same peace that his parents described from Eden. He felt God's punishment every time the land refused to yield crops. It was a love-hate relationship, a search for redemption in the midst of the pain of divine separation. Eve watched Cain with deep understanding, knowing that her firstborn carried more than just the physical weight of labor. She knew that Cain intensely felt the void left by God's absence. The nights were silent, and the mystery of a life without divine protection weighed heavily. Yet within Cain, there was a strong spirit, a desire to find answers, even if they weren't the ones he wanted to hear. As the years passed, Cain's role in the family solidified. He was the eldest, the responsible one, forging the path forward. But the weight of expectations and the search for redemption began to blend with a growing frustration. Something stirred in his spirit, like a storm that hadn't fully formed yet, but soon would. Cain, the firstborn, and Abel, his younger brother, grew up side by side, but their paths diverged early on. While Cain devoted himself to working the soil, Abel preferred tending to the flocks. Their distinct activities reflected their personalities as well. Cain, marked by the effort and sweat of dealing with the cursed ground, developed a resilient spirit, but one burdened with frustration. Abel, on the other hand, found peace and simplicity in tending to the animals, making him a serene figure in contrast to his older brother. The family dynamic, already shaped by Adam and Eve's fall, was filled with tension and expectations. Each son sought to please God, offering the best of their work in hopes of gaining his favor. Cain, with his calloused hands, presented the fruits of the earth, while Abel offered the finest parts of his sheep. Their offerings were not merely religious practices, but a pursuit of redemption and, in a way, divine protection. Yet, this brotherly dynamic would soon take a much darker turn. God's rejection of Cain's offering was a blow he couldn't bear. What was a spiritual connection for Abel became a symbol of personal failure for Cain. Abel's acceptance by God reinforced the mystery of why Cain was deemed less worthy. He felt that his hard work and dedication to the land were ignored. Envy began to creep into his heart, like a seed planted in fertile soil, growing quietly within him. Conversations between the two brothers became rarer. What had once been companionship slowly turned into a chasm of resentment. Abel, unaware of the full impact of his brother's rejection, continued living his life of faith, not realizing the storm brewing inside Cain. The firstborn's frustration was visible in his face, and Eve, ever watchful, noticed that Cain's spirit was burdened with growing anger, as if he were on the verge of exploding. Adam tried to calm the conflict, offering his eldest son advice. He knew how devastating God's rejection could be, having experienced separation from God himself. But a father's words, no matter how wise, could not penetrate Cain's hardened heart. He felt punished not only for the rejected offering, but for what he believed was a life doomed to failure. It was a cycle of pain that seemed unbreakable. Abel, in his simplicity, continued to serve God with a tranquil heart, which paradoxically fueled Cain's anger even more. Abel's acceptance by God seemed like a silent provocation. Every day, Abel's life served as a constant reminder of Cain's inadequacy. Cain's spiritual exile became more evident with each interaction between the brothers, as the mystery of his rejection weighed on him like an unbearable burden. Their brief conversations were filled with tension. Cain, seeing Abel prosper in his faith, couldn't hide his disdain. "Why does God look upon you with such favor, Abel?" he asked bitterly. Abel, with an almost naive sincerity, answered that he trusted in God's will, but his words only fanned the flames of Cain's growing rage. What began as a simple difference in their callings was about to become something far more dangerous. The tension reached an inevitable breaking point. Cain, feeling betrayed by life, the earth, and God, saw no other way out but to act. In the field, where the shadows of the trees danced in the wind, Cain made his decision. The soil he worked, the earth that rejected him, would now become the stage for the darkest act in human history thus far. Cain called Abel for a conversation, one last attempt to understand why God favored his brother and not him. "Why does he accept you and reject me?" he asked with bitterness. Abel, always calm, tried to reassure his brother, but his words seemed distant, unreachable for a heart consumed by anger. Abel's response, which praised God's will, only fueled the fire already burning inside Cain. At that moment, Cain no longer saw a brother before him, but a symbol of his own frustration and rejection. The ground that had absorbed so much of Cain's sweat was now about to absorb Abel's blood. In a rash and irreversible act, Cain struck. The impact was immediate, and Abel's body fell lifeless to the ground. The ensuing silence was deafening as Cain stared at his blood-stained hands, the symbol of the life he had taken. Cain's fall was swift and devastating. What had begun as a feeling of rejection culminated in an act of sheer destruction. He knew deep within his soul that he had crossed a line that could never be undone. But instead of finding redemption in the act, he found an even greater void. The mystery that had surrounded him since birth now deepened into a spiritual abyss. The earth, which he had tried so hard to conquer, now cried out against him as if Abel's blood was speaking directly to God from the soil. God, knowing Cain's heart and the act he had committed, did not hesitate to confront him. "Where is Abel, your brother?" God asked, his voice thundering in the heart of the murderer. Still in shock, Cain tried to hide his guilt with an evasive answer. "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" It was a futile attempt to escape the all-seeing eye of God, but the words that came from his lips were empty. He knew that God already had the answer. The dialogue between Cain and God is one of the most mysterious and meaningful passages in the Scriptures. In his justice, God did not let the crime go unpunished. "The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground," declared the Lord, sealing Cain's fate. The spilled blood demanded justice, and Cain felt the weight of the punishment that was coming. But instead of immediate death, God made a decision that would mark Cain for the rest of his life. He would be condemned to exile, to wander the earth as a fugitive. This punishment was, in a way, a cruel irony for Cain. The man who already felt rejected by the earth would now be forced to live without a place to call home. The protection that God placed on him, a mark to prevent others from killing him, made the exile even more bitter. He would live, yes, but his life would be marked by the eternal memory of his crime, without the possibility of immediate redemption. The mystery of divine justice involved both punishment and protection in a balance that Cain couldn't understand. The sense of loss was profound, not just for Abel's life but for Cain's own soul, now plunged into an abyss of loneliness. His exile began there, in that blood-stained field, and would stretch across his entire life. Cain, the firstborn of Adam and Eve, was now history's first murderer, bearing the burden of having taken his brother's life. Yet amid all this darkness, the mark on his forehead was a reminder that even in his sin, he was still under God's watchful eye. The scene of Cain's fall was one of desolation. The field, once the stage for fraternal conflict, was now enveloped in silence, as if creation itself mourned the shedding of blood. The trees seemed to shrink under the weight of death, and the earth, which had resisted Cain's efforts, now bore the weight of the first human tragedy. And so Cain departed, condemned to wander, leaving behind Abel's body and a shattered family. The murder of Abel was not just the end of a life, but the beginning of a new era of pain and separation for humanity. Cain, carrying the weight of his punishment, now had to face a future of exile. And with that punishment, he would be further distanced from the presence of God and his family, starting his journey as a wanderer, forever seeking redemption, yet never fully finding it. God, in his justice, condemned Cain to be a fugitive and wanderer on the earth. Cain's exile was not only physical but also spiritual. The distance between him and God had become an unbridgeable chasm. The earth, which had once sustained him, now refused to cooperate. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the soil beneath his feet was rejecting him, constantly reminding him of his punishment and his irreversible act. Cain's exile was also a reflection of his inner state. He carried the guilt of Abel's murder, a burden that would never leave him. Cain wandered, but he found no peace. The sense of abandonment was constant. He knew he could never return to his family or find solace in communion with God. There was mystery in what lay ahead, but also the certainty that his life would be marked by loneliness and the weight of his own choices. The earth, once his ally, now saw him as an enemy. Yet, despite the gravity of his crime, God, in his mercy, still offered protection to Cain. By placing a special mark on him, the Lord ensured that no one would kill him. The mark of Cain, though a symbol of punishment, also signified divine protection. Cain knew that, even though he was far from God's presence, he was still the recipient of an inexplicable grace. The mystery of this protection was both a relief and a source of bitterness for him, as he would live with the pain of his act forever. As Cain wandered the earth, he felt the weight of his isolation. He saw life continue without him, and exile became more than just a physical journey. It was a journey within himself, where he confronted his fears, regrets, and the deep pain of his sin. The wind blew against his face, and the dry earth beneath his feet seemed to echo his own soul. The feeling of being lost, without direction or purpose, made every day an internal battle. The exile was, in essence, the extension of his own fall. Reflecting on his punishment, Cain began to understand that exile was not only a physical punishment, but a way of living with the consequences of his choices. God's protection, symbolized by the mark on his forehead, served as a constant reminder that, even in his punishment, he was still under divine watch. The mystery of this duality, being punished yet still protected, troubled his mind. He knew he could not escape God's justice, but at the same time this justice was intertwined with a silent, invisible mercy. Throughout his exile, Cain encountered desolate and barren lands, places that seemed to reflect his own soul. The nights were long and lonely, and the silence weighed on him like a burden. The sound of his own footsteps was his only constant companion, and the weight of his punishment made each journey more arduous. He wondered if at some point he would find redemption, but the truth was that no matter how hard he searched, the emptiness inside him seemed immeasurable. The presence of God, once felt by his family, now seemed only a distant memory. Even with God's protection, Cain lived in fear. He knew that his crime made him vulnerable to revenge, but God had promised that no one would kill him. This protection, paradoxically, kept him alive to face the punishment of his conscience, a reality from which he could not escape. And so, Cain's life became a constant cycle of seeking peace and fleeing from his own guilt. Exile was his new home, and the earth, once familiar to him, now became his enemy. Cain's journey across the land took him farther and farther from his family and from God. The mystery of his survival, even after committing such a heinous act, was a constant reminder of the complexity of divine justice. He was punished, yet protected; condemned, yet still alive. His exile distanced him from what he knew, but also pushed him into new lands, like the mysterious land of Nod, where he would finally settle, carrying with him the weight of his past and the challenge of building a future in the midst of desolation. Nod, a place as mysterious as Cain's own fate, lay to the east of Eden, a territory unknown to him. As he stepped onto that land, he didn't know what to expect. Would this be where he would find refuge, or just another stage in his eternal exile? The land of Nod, by its very nature, carried an air of loneliness and desolation, reflecting Cain's inner state. It was a new beginning, but still under the weight of his punishment. The environment in Nod was hostile. The dry, barren soil resisted cultivation, as if the curse that followed Cain had extended to this new land as well. He knew that his skills as a farmer wouldn't be enough to turn that infertile soil into something productive. The land of Nod was, in a way, an extension of the curse that Cain carried. Yet it was here that he would settle with no other option, forced to adapt to this new reality of isolation and difficulty. Life in Nod was solitary, and Cain felt that the land welcomed him with the same indifference he had experienced throughout his journey. The silence of the place was unsettling, and the emptiness seemed to echo in his soul. The mystery of his future constantly hovered over him. Who would he be now in this new place? The weight of his exile never left him, but Nod, for all its hostility, offered him a chance to start again, even though it was far from everything and everyone. The land of Nod was both a refuge and a prison. The contrast between the promise of redemption and the reality of punishment was always evident. In Nod, Cain tried to build a new life, but the ghost of his past was ever present. He felt that no matter how hard he tried, he would never escape what he had done. The land of Nod did not forgive easily, and the soil seemed to resist every new attempt at cultivation. Cain's hands, once strong and skilled, now struggled against a land that refused to cooperate, as if creation itself was turning against him. Still, Cain began to build something in that land. He knew that, for all its hardships, he had to survive. Nod was the place where his descendants would begin to emerge. The mystery of survival guided him, and slowly he began to lay the foundations of a new life. Though the soil was infertile and the conditions harsh, Cain knew he had to continue. He began to understand that the land of Nod was a reflection of his spiritual state, distant, barren, but with a latent possibility of transformation. As Cain reflected on his life while building his new home, he knew that the weight of his crime would never leave him, but he felt that there was something in Nod that allowed him, in some way, to start again. Perhaps it was the fact that no one there knew him, that he could build something without the constant judgment of his past. Nod offered him refuge, albeit a temporary one, from the guilt that consumed him. The mystery of the place intrigued him, but it also scared him, for he knew that even here he couldn't escape God's gaze. The land of Nod, though desolate, began to change under Cain's hands. He knew that his journey was far from over, but there was something comforting in being able to shape a new future. The soil that once rejected him now slowly began to yield, as if the land itself was accepting his presence. His punishment was still a constant shadow, But Nod offered a glimpse of redemption, however faint. The mystery of his new life was beginning to unfold as he built his foundations in that inhospitable land. As Cain adapted to his new reality, life in Nod began to take shape. He knew that this land, as barren as it was, would be the setting for his new story. And as time passed, the desire to settle down and leave a legacy grew stronger. He wanted more than just to survive. He wanted to build something that would last, something he could leave for his descendants. And it is in this new phase that one of the most enigmatic questions of Cain's story arises. Who would his wife be? The woman who would share this journey with him? The Bible briefly mentions that Cain had a wife, but her name and origin remains shrouded in mystery. This gap in Scripture leaves room for speculation. Who was this woman who would unite with Cain knowing his past? The most likely answer, according to traditional interpretations, is that his wife was a direct descendant of Adam and Eve, possibly one of his sisters. At that time, close family relations were not viewed as we see them today. For Cain, living in exile and under the weight of his punishment, the presence of a wife represented something much greater than just companionship. She would be the person with whom he would share his struggles and his desire for redemption. Cain's marriage, though shrouded in mystery, marks the beginning of his new life, in which he would attempt to rebuild something meaningful after the tragic event of Abel's murder. The question of his descendants also raises many questions. Cain, as a wanderer and exile, knew that the only way to leave a legacy was through his children. The birth of his descendants in Nod reflects his attempt to build something that transcended the pain of his past. Yet the mystery remains. How could someone carrying such a heavy mark build a family? The answer may lie in the duality of his punishment and protection, where even in condemnation, he was still under divine grace. For his wife living alongside Cain was no easy task. She knew her husband's story, the weight he carried for spilling Abel's blood. Yet she chose to stay with him, a choice that required courage and faith. Life in Nod offered no guarantees, and though God's presence felt distant, it still hovered over them. Cain's union with his wife is a reminder that even in the midst of exile and punishment, the human desire for connection and descendants remains. Cain's marriage also symbolizes a quiet form of redemption. Even after committing the greatest crime in human history up to that point, he still found someone willing to share his life. This speaks volumes about the complexity of human nature and divine justice. Cain's punishment had distanced him from God's presence, but life went on, and he knew that his descendants would continue his lineage. The mystery of his wife, therefore, is not just about her identity, but also about the nature of the relationship that developed between the two. As Cain built his life in Nod, his wife became his partner in this journey. Together they faced the challenges of a hostile land and the uncertainty of the future. For Cain, who had once been completely alone, this new phase of his life offered a glimpse of something more. Cain's wife, though unnamed in the scriptures, represented the continuation of his story, the possibility of creating a new path amid difficulties. She was the first to trust him after his crime, the first to see beyond the mark of punishment he bore. Cain's descendants, the fruit of this union, would carry not only the land of Nod, but also the complexity of their father's story. Each child born from that union would bear the weight of the past and the hope for a different future. The mystery surrounding Cain's wife serves as a reminder that even in the darkest stories, there are moments of redemption and rebirth where life can flourish in unexpected places. Amid the exile, Cain made a surprising decision: to found a city. This act clearly marked an attempt to leave a legacy, to rebuild something that until then seemed impossible. The city, which he named after his son Enoch, would be a symbol of his determination to continue his lineage. For someone who had been condemned to wander as a fugitive, founding a city was a way to reaffirm his desire to take root, to establish something solid in the chaos of his life. The construction of the city of Enoch was not just a physical work, but also a manifestation of personal redemption for Cain. He who had once destroyed life now found himself building a future for his descendants. The city was the opposite of the field where he had spilled Abel's blood. It was an effort to create rather than destroy. Every brick, every wall raised in Enoch was an attempt by Cain to overcome the weight of his past and to prove, perhaps to himself, that there was still hope in his journey. The name Enoch carries deep symbolism. By naming the city after his son, Cain was expressing his desire for that city to be a place of continuity and prosperity for his descendants. Enoch, as the fruit of his union with his wife, represented the hope that the cycle of exile and punishment could be interrupted through the next generation. The city then was more than a physical settlement. It was a symbol of protection and redemption, a refuge for Cain's new lineage. The mystery that surrounded Cain's life now intertwined with the destiny of his city. The city of Enoch, despite being founded by a man marked by violence, would be the place where his children would grow and prosper. For Cain, the founding of this city was a way to compensate, at least partially, for the destruction he had caused. He could not erase the past, but by building a new life he hoped to offer his descendants a chance to live free from the weight of his crime. In Enoch, Cain began to see the fruits of his efforts. What had once seemed impossible, creating something lasting in the midst of exile, was now becoming a reality. The city grew, and with it, Cain's descendants. The legacy of the firstborn of Adam and Eve, though marred by tragedy and sin, was beginning to transform into something more. God's punishment had condemned him to wander, but Cain found a way to make the exile an opportunity to build, to create, and to leave something that would last beyond his own life. The city of Enoch also represented a form of protection for Cain's family. Even with the mark of God protecting him from being killed, Cain knew that the world around him was dangerous. The founding of a city offered not only physical shelter, but also a sense of spiritual security. Within the city walls, Cain and his family could live away from external threats and focus on their own survival. The construction of Enoch was a response to exile, an attempt to recreate what had been lost in Eden, a place where life could flourish. As Enoch grew, Cain saw himself reflected in the city's walls. It was impossible for him to ignore the contrast between the man who had destroyed and the man who now built. The city of Enoch represented, for Cain, the possibility of redemption, even if only partial. He knew he could never erase what he had done, but building something new offered him the chance of a new beginning. The mystery of his life continued, but now he had something to leave for future generations. However, Cain's fate was not completely resolved. He knew that despite founding a city, his past would always follow him. Enoch, the city, was an attempt to create a different future. But Cain carried with him the knowledge that the silence about his ultimate destiny was something he would have to live with. The founding of the city was a milestone in his journey, but it was not the end of his story. Cain would still have to face the uncertainty of what awaited him at the end of his life. The final fate of Cain remains shrouded in mystery. The Bible, which details his fall and exile, is intriguingly silent about the final days of his life. This silence leaves room for countless speculations and theological reflections. What happened to humanity's first murderer after the founding of the city of Enoch? Did Cain live out his days in exile, cut off from God's presence, or did he somehow find silent redemption? His story's end is left open, inviting each generation to reflect on what this silence could mean. This silence could be interpreted as a way of showing that Cain, despite his city and descendants, never fully found inner peace. He was condemned to wander, and that condemnation may have been as spiritual as it was physical. The absence of details about his end suggests that, just as divine justice is hard to fully grasp, so too is Cain's ultimate fate. He doesn't disappear, but dissolves into the mystery of the biblical narrative, unresolved, leaving readers and scholars intrigued. Theologians differ in their interpretations. Some suggest that the silence is deliberate, a way to symbolize that Cain's story is not about redemption, but about the consequences of his actions. He may have lived the rest of his days far from God's presence, carrying the weight of his sin until his death. Others, however, believe that the silence offers an open door to imagine possible redemption. Perhaps in his solitude, Cain found a way to reconcile with God, but the Bible chooses not to reveal that detail, preserving the mystery. Jewish tradition also offers some speculation about Cain's end. Some ancient texts suggest that he may have been accidentally killed by one of his descendants, a tragedy reflecting the cycle of violence that began with Abel's murder. Other traditions state that Cain lived to old age, witnessing the multiplication of his descendants but always under the shadow of his sin. Regardless of the versions, the fact remains that Cain's fate is an enigma, echoing the mystery that his life represented. The silence surrounding Cain's ultimate fate could also be a lesson for readers. Not all human stories have a clearly defined ending. Sometimes punishment, exile, and the search for redemption have no satisfying conclusion. Cain, the man who initiated humanity's cycle of violence, may symbolize this uncomfortable truth. Some wounds never fully heal, and some lives are left without clear resolution. This silence is both an absence of details and a message in itself, a reflection on the mystery of the human condition. The city of Enoch, founded by Cain, remains in the biblical narrative as a testament to his attempt at rebuilding. But the man behind the city fades from the scriptures, as if time had silenced his voice. It's as if Cain fulfilled his role in human history and was simultaneously forgotten, consumed by the silence of his own exile. This mystery surrounding his end makes Cain a powerful figure, representing both the fragility of human life and the complexity of divine justice. The Bible's silence about Cain's fate is no accident. It invites us to reflect on the limits of justice and mercy. Did Cain, despite founding a city, manage to overcome the weight of his past? Did he die in peace, or was his death the end of a life marked by punishment and exile? These questions have no clear answers, but they are part of the depth of Cain's story. His life is an invitation to think about our own choices, our own struggles, and the consequences they bring. In the end, Cain remains an enigma. His story, filled with mystery, partial redemption, and exile, ends in silence. There are no records of his death, no details of his final days. He disappears from the biblical narrative, but he lives on in the minds of those who reflect on his journey. The silence surrounding his fate is perhaps the most powerful way to conclude his story, leaving room for reflection on the nature of punishment, divine protection, and humanity's search for redemption, even in the darkest of circumstances. Now that you know the story behind Cain and the mystery of his wife, what can this teach us about the consequences of our choices and the search for redemption? Think for a moment. Like Cain, do we sometimes feel exiled, cut off from what truly matters, yet still have the opportunity to rebuild? How does this impact your relationships and the way you deal with your own mistakes? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your opinion about this fascinating story and what stood out most to you. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and hit the like button. That way, you won't miss any content that can help you grow spiritually. And now, as promised, let's say a powerful prayer to bring even more wisdom and connection with God. Lord God, we come to you at this moment with open hearts, reflecting on the story of Cain and the profound lessons it teaches us. Like Cain, we often find ourselves lost, trying to deal with the consequences of our choices, facing emotional and spiritual exiles. We ask, Lord, that you give us wisdom to recognize our mistakes and courage to seek redemption, knowing that even in punishment, you still protect us and invite us to start anew. Father, just as Cain built something new despite his past, help us build a life that honors you, a life of purpose, even as we carry the scars of past decisions. May we understand that, even in the shadows of our own exile, you are with us, ready to guide us back into your presence. May this story teach us to value the relationships we build and always seek the path of reconciliation, both with others and with you, Lord. Give us strength to face challenges and wisdom to move forward, knowing that just as Cain was protected by your hand, we too are under your care. In the name of Jesus, we ask that this knowledge transform our lives and draw us even closer to you. Amen.